It's a bit strange, when you think about it, that a series about zombies and shotguns and men in trench coats actually starts with a flower. Not a lab, not a bomb, a plant growing in a cave in West Africa that almost nobody has ever mentioned in the 30 years people have been playing these games. And once you know it's there, the whole thing looks different. So that's what tonight is. We're going through the creatures, where they came from, what the files actually say about them, and the odd little details buried in research memos that never made it into a cutscene. Some of it is horrible, some of it is sad, a lot of it is just very strange corporate paperwork about monsters. There's no order to it, really. You can drift off in the middle of any of this and you won't have missed a twist because there isn't one. If you fancy sticking around for more of these, there's a subscribe button somewhere down there. Right, let's start with the flower. The plant is called Sonnentreppe, which is German, and translates roughly to stairway of the sun. That's also what it's called in English, so at some point someone made a decision, and everyone just went along with it. It's a member of the Asteraceae family, which is the same family as sunflowers and chrysanthemums. So botanically, it's not exotic at all. The head has 8 fused petals, all of them slightly the wrong shape, and the colour shifts from an orange-red at the centre out toward yellow. Perfectly nice looking thing. You'd put it in a garden. It grows underground, which is the first properly odd bit. Flowers as a rule need sunlight, and this one manages in a cavern system in West Africa, in a spot the locals called the Garden of the Sun. Whatever combination of temperature and humidity and mineral content exists down there, that specific environment is doing something to the plant that nowhere else on Earth can replicate. Hold that thought, because it becomes a 22-year problem for some very well-funded people later. The Endopia knew about it long before anyone with a laboratory did. Their kings weren't chosen by bloodline, they were chosen by trial, and the final part of the trial was eating the flower. If you survived, you were the god king. That was the whole system. That system has an obvious problem though. Almost nobody survived. The flower is enormously toxic to essentially everyone, because human genetics and this particular organism are a terrible match. The overwhelming majority of people who ate it died fairly unpleasantly. But the rare person whose body could take it came out the other side, stronger, sharper, and much longer lived. Kings who passed the trial could reign for centuries. I love that as a piece of world building, because it's a selection process that's honest about what it is. You're not being tested on wisdom or courage. You're being tested on whether your specific genome happens to be compatible with a virus. It's a lottery dressed up as a coronation. And the results show. The Endopia built properly impressive architecture, and the in-universe explanation is that the enhanced intellect of the survivors is what got them there. A civilization partly built by people who won a genetic coin flip. Now the western end of this story starts with a man called Henry Travis, 19th century explorer wandering around the region, documenting the wildlife and the plants and the local beliefs, and he writes up the business with the magical flowers and the king-making ritual. And he gets absolutely laughed at for it. Discredited, filed under eccentric Victorian with sunstroke and forgotten about. Which, fair enough. If someone hands you a travelogue claiming there's a flower that makes people immortal, you're not rushing that to print. Except a century later, in the 1960s, Travis's writing lands in front of a circle of European academics with an interest in eugenics, and one of them is a paleovirologist called James Marcus. Marcus reads it and comes to a conclusion that is, annoyingly, correct. He decides the flower's properties aren't magic, they're a retrovirus. So in 1966, an expedition goes out. Marcus, Oswell Spencer, Edward Ashford, and a researcher called Brandon Bailey. 3 months of searching, which sounds romantic until you consider 3 months of climbing around a cave system in the hope that a dead man's discredited notebook was right. And by the 4th of December, They have already found the garden of the sun and the flowers, and they isolate the virus. Poor Henry Travis, correct the entire time, dead for decades, and nobody's putting his name on anything. Then comes the part I actually find funniest. They've got the flower. They've got the virus. So obviously the next step is to grow more flowers somewhere convenient. And they cannot do it. Not it's difficult, they genuinely cannot. Bailey works out that the local environmental conditions are what's switching the thing on in the first place. And outside the cave you get a perfectly healthy plant that produces nothing at all. The virus in the flower's genome sits there as inactive junk DNA. Something about that specific cave wakes it up. Take the plant away, and it goes back to sleep and stays asleep. So one of the largest and most secretive research operations in the world spends the next 2 decades trying to grow a daisy properly. They didn't manage artificial culturing until 1988. 22 years. There's something wonderfully humbling about that. All the money, all the facilities, all the ambition, and the bottleneck is horticulture. The virus itself is called Progenitor, and it's the thing every single creature in this series eventually traces back to. Most zombies, most parasites, most enormous things with too many arms in this series trace back to it. Almost all of it comes off this one plant, from this one cave, because a Victorian nobody believed wrote it down and got called a liar. The one detail about Progenitor that separates it from anything real is this. Actual viruses are fussy. They need a compatible host. They infect specific cell types in specific animals, and cross-species transmission is rare. Progenitor doesn't care. Animal, plant, fungus, bacteria, it can get into any of them, and it can reverse cell death. It can bring something back that has been dead for a considerable stretch of time. That's the property everyone spends the next 50 years chasing. Not the strength, not the intelligence, the bit where dead things stop being dead. Anyway, that's the flower. Everything after this is people trying to make it do something useful, and mostly failing in expensive and horrifying ways. Now let's talk a bit about zombies, because I think most people have the mechanism completely backwards, and the actual explanation is more interesting than the one everyone assumes. The film version of a zombie is a corpse animated by malice, something dead that wants you dead. That's the horror shorthand, and it works fine on screen. But the research files in this series describe something quite different, and it's not really about hunger for flesh at all. It's about metabolism. Here's what the T-virus does to a person. It gets in, it starts rewriting cells at an absurd rate, and most of that rewriting goes badly. Tissue breaks down under the strain. Higher brain function collapses almost immediately, because the brain is the most delicate thing in the body, and it does not enjoy being restructured on the fly. What survives is the brain stem, and a body running at a metabolic rate it was never designed for. And that's the crux of it. The infected body is burning through energy constantly. It cannot stop, so it needs protein, urgently and permanently, and the nearest available protein is whoever's standing in the corridor. They're not evil, they're starving, and they will never, ever stop starving. I find that's a considerably grimmer idea than a monster that just wants to hurt you. There's no intent in it. It's a body with the accelerator jammed down, doing the only thing left that might keep it running, which explains a few behaviours that always looked like sloppy game design. They eat each other. Not out of aggression, but because a fellow zombie is meat, and meat is meat. They'll strip a corpse that's been on the floor for days. They go for anything that registers as food. The virus came out of James Marcus, incidentally, who took that flower we've been talking about and combined it with leech DNA. Leeches are an inspired choice if you're trying to weaken something. Progenitor, in its pure form, is far too lethal to be useful. Kill everything and you don't have a weapon, you have a disposal problem. Marcus needed a version that would leave a body standing up afterward, and the leech genome gave him the stability to do it. There's a lovely bit of irony there, The T virus, the thing that defines the entire franchise, exists because pure Progenitor was too good at killing people. The zombie is a compromise. It's the diluted version. There's a part of this that gets skipped almost every time. Umbrella never wanted zombies. Nobody in that company sat in a boardroom and said, right, let's make the shuffling ones. A zombie is what you get when the infection fails to produce anything better. It's the default outcome, the baseline, the thing that happens when a body isn't compatible with whatever they were actually aiming for. Every corridor full of them represents a project that didn't work. Now the bit that leads somewhere else, when an infected body can't find enough to eat, it doesn't just wander about looking peckish. It drops into something close to hibernation. Energy expenditure falls off a cliff, the body goes still, and to anybody walking past it looks dead. Properly dead. On the floor, not moving, done. It isn't done. That state is a holding pattern. The body is conserving what it has and waiting for conditions to change. And depending on which strain of the virus is in there, what happens next varies enormously. Sometimes nothing happens and it just lies there indefinitely. Sometimes something considerably worse happens. This is also why the survivors in these games develop the habit of shooting bodies that are already on the ground, which from the outside looks like panic and is in fact good procedure. One more thing about the virus itself that I think is underrated. It's not one thing. People say the T virus like it's a single substance in a single vial, and it really isn't. There are dozens of strains, and they behave differently enough that 2 outbreaks in 2 cities can produce completely different creatures. Marcus made his version. Birkin refined a different one. The European labs had their own. Every branch was tinkering, every tinker produced a variant, and the variants don't play nicely with each other's assumptions. That matters more than it sounds, because a lot of the arguments fans have about this series come down to 2 people describing 2 different strains and assuming they're describing the same thing. Animals are worth a mention while we're here. The virus does infect them, and the results can be as dramatic as in humans. There's less to go wrong. What you generally get is increased size and increased aggression, rather than wholesale restructuring, which is how you end up with the dogs, the crows, the enormous spiders. Nothing exotic, just a normal animal with the volume turned up. The dogs are the one everyone remembers, and I've always thought there's a reason for that beyond the window. A zombie moves badly. It's slow and it telegraphs everything. A dog with the same infection is still a dog, which means it's still fast, still coordinated, still capable of running you down in a corridor. The virus didn't need to improve them. It just needed to remove whatever was stopping them. But now, back to those bodies lying on the floor, pretending to be finished. Because at one particular facility, in one particular summer, the staff worked out the hard way that leaving them there was a serious mistake. The Arclay facility, the one underneath the mansion, was working on a strain designated T virus. It got out during a lab accident, which is how most things in this company get out. And the staff started falling ill in the way you'd expect. What they weren't expecting was the second part. The T virus has a quirk and Umbrella has a term for it. VAST, viral activation. When a body infected with this particular strain goes down, the virus doesn't settle. It restarts. Tissue regenerates, but badly, with heavy necrosis and blood seeping up through the skin, which turns the whole body a deep red. That's where the name comes from. The nails harden into claws, the muscles rebuild denser, and it gets up. The thing that stands up is faster than what went down. Not shuffling, running. It's tougher. It takes a lot more to put down a second time. And there's a flicker of something like intelligence in how it moves. Not much, enough to be a problem. The first one was designated Crimson Head Prototype 1, and they kept it. Of course they kept it. Novel mutation, unprecedented behaviour. Obviously you study it. So they held on to this thing and studied it. And during feeding it killed several people, and at that point the calculation changed, and it got shut in a coffin behind the mansion. I want to sit with that for a second, because it's such a perfectly umbrella sequence of events. Something horrific happens. The response is not containment, it's curiosity. The curiosity kills staff. Only then does anyone reach for a lid. And this is where you get the detail, I think is the single bleakest thing in the whole Arklay story. And it's not in a cutscene. It's in the files. The staff had no training for this. Nothing in their induction covered it. There was no protocol, no memo from head office, no safety procedure, because the mutation was brand new and nobody upstairs had written anything down yet. These were researchers and security guards and cleaners in a facility that was quietly falling apart, and they were the first people in history to encounter this, so they worked it out themselves. Word of mouth, destroy the bodies. If one goes down, don't leave it. Burn it, take the head off, do something, but don't walk away from it. It became, in later descriptions of the incident, an informal policy, which is a phrase that carries an enormous amount of quiet terror. Not a procedure, not a rule. A thing frightened people started telling each other in corridors because they'd seen what happened to whoever didn't. That's why there's kerosene lying around the mansion. That's the entire in-universe explanation for one of the mechanics everybody remembers. Somebody who worked there at some point went and got a fuel can and started leaving it in useful places because they'd noticed a pattern and had no one to report it to. Sort of like how, in any workplace, the important safety information is never in the handbook. It's the thing the bloke who's been there 15 years tells you on your first day. Now, a few things about the mutation itself. It's not universal. It depends entirely on which strain you've been infected with, which is why this doesn't happen everywhere. The epsilon strain in that specific facility produces this specific outcome, and elsewhere, the same virus family does something else entirely. It also requires the body to be intact enough to work with. Decapitation stops it. Incineration stops it. Sufficient structural damage to the legs stops it, which is a slightly gruesome bit of engineering logic, but there you go. The process needs raw material, and if you've removed the raw material, nothing happens. And it's on a timer, not a fixed one, but the body needs a stretch of undisturbed time to do the rebuilding, which means the horrible version of this is that you can walk through a room, note the bodies, get on with your day, and walk back through the same room an hour later into something completely different. The geography of a place you've already cleared stops being reliable. I think that's the actual horror of it, more than the claws. It's the loss of the safe room. It's a building that quietly reloads behind you. Here's the fun detail though, and it's an odd one. Crimson Heads actually show up in several different games. The 2002 remake of the original, and briefly in Umbrella Chronicles, and then in a few later spin-offs. Not as a widespread mutation in Raccoon City, not as a major force in any later outbreak, nowhere. Fans spent years assuming that was a design decision, and it partly was, but there's an in-universe answer for it as well, and it's a good one. The epsilon strain that caused all this at Arklay didn't stay in its original form. Somebody got hold of the VACT data, decided it was fascinating, and set about improving it. The refined version doesn't produce Crimson Heads. It skips that stage completely. It produces something worse. Start with the skull because the skull is the part that tells you everything. In a liquor, the brain grows. Not slightly. It expands until the cranium can no longer contain it, and then the cranium gives way, and the brain sits there on top of the body, exposed, wrapped in a membrane that has toughened up enough to take a bullet, which is a sentence I still find slightly ridiculous and also completely horrible. The skin goes next, all of it, shed entirely, which leaves the musculature bare and visible. There's a practical reason for that, apparently. Skin is weight, and skin restricts movement, and if you're optimizing for speed above everything else, then the skin is just in the way. So off it comes. The bone structure rebuilds for 4 limbs rather than 2. The hands develop enormous talons. primarily for gripping, which is how the thing gets up walls and across ceilings without appearing to think about it. And the tongue, which is the bit everyone remembers, becomes long and barbed and strong enough to punch through a body. There are records of it taking a head off. The eyes are gone. Completely. It has no visual sense at all. What it has instead is hearing. And the hearing is extraordinary. That's the whole design, really. Blind ambush predator with perfect acoustic tracking, clinging to a ceiling in a dark room, waiting for someone to make a noise. Which is why the quiet weapons work so well against them, and why the loud ones tend to attract other lickers. Now, how you get one? This is a further mutation of an infected human, and it happens to bodies that have gone into that starvation dormancy we talked about earlier, but not with the Arklay strain, with the refined version. William Birkin took the V-Acti data recovered from the mansion and reworked it, because Birkin's defining personality trait is an inability to leave anything alone. What he produced still triggers a secondary mutation in a weakened near-dead host, but it routes the process somewhere else entirely. No red skin, no claws, no runner. This instead. So the Raccoon City outbreak, which used the refined strain, has lickers and doesn't have crimson heads. And the mansion, which had the original, has crimson heads and doesn't have lickers. Two branches off the same accident. Now I should be honest here, because this is one of the genuinely contested corners of the law, and I'd rather say so than pretend it's settled. There's a school of thought that lickers are what a crimson head eventually becomes, if left long enough, a third stage rather than a parallel one. Darkside Chronicles says only that they evolved from zombies, which clarifies precisely nothing. People have been arguing about this since roughly 2002, and they will still be arguing about it in 20 years. Both readings work with the files. Take your pick. Here's the detail that actually unsettles me though, and it's not the tongue. When a person becomes a zombie, they lose almost everything upstairs. That's the trade, but the licker's brain, having expanded so aggressively, gets some of it back. Not personality, not memory, as far as anyone can tell, but capability. There are recorded observations of lickers deliberately destroying security cameras. That's not instinct. Nothing in a predator's toolkit tells it to identify a small object mounted high on a wall, recognize it as a thing that observes and remove it. That's a creature working out that it's being watched and doing something about it. They also show genuine tactical behavior when hunting, positioning, patience, waiting for the right moment, rather than charging at the first sound. Something in there is thinking. Not well and not about much, but it's thinking. And that's the bit that turns them from a monster into something properly grim. A zombie is a person who's gone. A licker is a person who's gone and then had something else grown in the space where they used to be, and that something else is smart enough to want the cameras off. There are variants, naturally, because there always are. Later specimens turn up with a greyish-green coloration, thicker hides, larger claws, and a lot more staying power. And the one that gets me is this. After Umbrella collapsed and its stock ended up scattered across the black market, there was specific demand for lickers. Buyers wanted them, for their durability, and pointedly, for their intelligence. Tricell obliged and produced a modified line to meet the market. So this thing, which exists because a starving corpse mutated in a way nobody planned, ended up on a product list. Somebody wrote a spec sheet for it. Somebody had a price. The transitional state is worth a mention too, because it's not instant. Between the zombie and the finished licker, there's a stage where the skull is melting away, and the tongue has developed, but the rest of the body hasn't caught up, and it's hanging about, half-made, in the dark, which is arguably a worse thing to find than the finished article. Right, that's enough teeth. Let's talk about a person for a bit, because the next one is about somebody who was never meant to be a monster at all. She kept the faces. That's the thing. Everyone knows about Lisa Trevor before they know anything else. This figure moving through the underground of the mansion, wearing a mask sewn together out of other people's faces. It's the sort of image that ends up on lists, and it usually gets filed under creepy and left there. The reason she has them is much worse than the image. Lisa was a girl. Her father was an architect, hired for the mansion, and the family came out to the Arklay Mountains in the late 60s, and then the family didn't leave. Lisa and her mother were taken by Umbrella and used as test subjects. Her father was kept alive elsewhere, alone for a while. Lisa was injected with Progenitor, not a diluted strain, not a weapon, the thing itself. And against every expectation she survived it, partially bonded with it, and started developing strength no one her size should have, which, from a research standpoint, made her the most valuable object in the building. So they kept going. For roughly 3 decades, every new compound, every new variant, every experimental agent that came out of that facility, they put it in her, because she was the one subject who kept surviving things. She stopped being a person, to those researchers, within about a week, and became a piece of equipment that happened to breathe. Her body changed enormously over those years. Bulk in the wrong places, growths, a face that stopped being a face. She became extraordinarily hard to injure and effectively impossible to kill, which meant there was no natural end to the process. Anything they did to her, she recovered from, which was read as permission to do it again. And her mind went, slowly, unevenly, over decades. Not all at once, which is the part I can't quite get past. There would have been years in the middle where she understood enough to know something was wrong, and not enough to do anything with that. Her mother died. Same trials, no such luck with the compatibility. At some point after that, an employee tried to pass themselves off as Lisa's mother. I've seen a few explanations offered for why, calming her, controlling her, moving her between rooms without a struggle, and none of them make it better. Whatever the reason, Lisa saw through it, or half saw through it, and she killed them, and then she took the face. Because the face was the part that was wrong, the face was the lie, and somewhere in what was left of her thinking, if she could get the right face, she could take it back to her mother, and things would be sorted out. So she kept collecting, kept sewing, kept looking for a woman who had been dead for years, holding a stack of other people's faces, in the dark under a house she and her father were partly responsible for building. There's a lot of horror in this series that I enjoy in a straightforward way. Big monster, silly gun, off you go. This isn't that. This is the one that sits wrong afterward. Now the part that matters for everything else, we're going to talk about tonight. And I'll keep it brief, because it's clinical, and she deserves better than being a footnote in someone's research career. In 1988, the European side of the company had a parasite in development that they could not get to work. Every host died within about 5 minutes of implantation. Not a few hosts, every one. So somebody at Arklay suggested Lisa, on the reasoning that she'd survived everything else, and might survive this. They implanted it. It went in, it reached her brain, and then it vanished. Her immune system had destroyed it, which had never once happened, anywhere. William Birkin went looking for why, and in her cells, he found something he hadn't seen before, a virus that had emerged out of everything they'd been putting into her for 30 years, absorbing it, folding it in, becoming something new. He named it G, and he built the rest of his life on it. So the entire back half of this franchise, the thing Birkin dies for, the thing an entire city is destroyed over, exists because of what was done to one child across 3 decades. And the games are, to their credit, quite clear-eyed about this. In universe, it only ever gets acknowledged indirectly in Umbrella Research's files and Birkin's notes. There's no scene where someone says her name with any weight. Birkin certainly does. She's a data point in a career that was going well. The one thing she's given, right at the end, is that she's finally allowed to stop. Her mother's remains are found, and Jill takes them, and she goes quiet. It's not a happy ending by any measure. It's just the first thing anyone's done for her rather than to her since she was a girl. I don't know. Of everything in these games, that's the one I'd have written differently, and I'm not sure I'd have written it better. Anyway, let's go somewhere with less of a soul to it and talk about the department that was building things on purpose. Since we're on the subject of Umbrella's paperwork, the Hunter files are worth a look, because they read exactly like a product development program, and that's what makes them so grim. The model numbers are MA120 and MA121, and the concept is straightforward. Take a human base, splice in reptile genetics, apply the virus, and see what comes out. The reptile side is where the skin comes from, and the claws and the frankly unreasonable jumping. What you end up with is a bipedal thing about the size of a person, faster, stronger, with enough coordination to open a door and enough intelligence to follow simple instruction. Which was the entire point. Zombies can't be directed. A hunter can. That's the leap they were trying to make. Now, the line in that file that I keep coming back to, the first test subjects were homeless adults, not volunteers, not prisoners even, which is the usual grim shorthand this series reaches for. Homeless people picked up off the streets specifically because they were adults nobody would come looking for. That's the selection criterion. Absence of anyone who'd notice. It's one sentence in a research summary, and it tells you more about how that company thought than any villain monologue in the whole series. There's no cruelty in it. There's not even malice, really. It's a logistics decision. Somebody sat down and worked out which raw material carried the least downstream risk, and that was the answer. And they wrote it down and moved on to the next section. The other thing the files make clear is that this project was a disaster for most of its life. Development ran from roughly 1981 through 1997, which is 16 years, and produced very nearly nothing usable. The working models don't appear until early 1998. Everything before that is failures, subjects that died, subjects that came out unstable, subjects that came out fine, but couldn't be controlled, which for these purposes is the same as a failure. 16 years of that, somebody had a whole career in there. And when the finished ones do arrive, one of the small horrible details in the guides is that STRS accounted for 22 of them at the mansion, which implies a fairly casual attitude to how many were in the building, and rather suggests some were still being held for study when everything went sideways and the doors stopped working. Now the corporate soap opera, because this is where it gets almost funny. Umbrella's American branch was winning. The Hunters were theirs. The Tyrant program was theirs. G was theirs. And the way that company was structured, whichever division produced results, got the budget and the influence and the ear of the board. So the American side was steadily accumulating power, and the European side was steadily not. The European response was not to try something different. It was to build a better Hunter. That's Hunter Gamma. Model number MA124, the Gamma denoting this third Hunter variant. And it exists for essentially no reason except that Europe wanted a thing that could outperform the American product in a like-for-like comparison. It's amphibian rather than reptilian. It's got an enormous mouth, and it's fundamentally the same idea with a different accent. And then, when Raccoon City went under, the European branch shipped their units in. American hunters and European hunter gammas into the same city at the same time, deliberately, to see which performed better against live human survivors. That's a benchmark test. One department using Raccoon City, a city of 100,000 people, as the test environment for their bioweapons, because the alternative was losing an argument in a meeting. I think that's the thing that damns them hardest. And it's not a monster or a virus. It's an internal rivalry. Now, a fun detail on the Hunter itself, because I've had this argument with people before. The decapitation move, the one where it gets close and takes your head off in a single swipe, is not a bit of gameplay flourish. It's in the design documentation as an intended capability, Somebody specified that. Somebody looked at the spec and thought, yes, that's the finish we want on this. There's also concept art floating about where the hunter has a visible nose, which it doesn't in the final creature, and I find that oddly funny. At some point in development, someone decided the nose was making it too relatable and took it off. The thing I'd add, though, and this is a slightly grudging compliment to Umbrella's designers, is that the hunter is the one BOW that actually works as advertised. Most of the things we're talking about tonight are accidents or failures or projects that got out of hand. The hunter did what it said on the tin. It went into a building and killed people efficiently and could be pointed in a direction, which is arguably worse than the failures. The failures are a company being reckless. The hunter is a company being competent. And speaking of competent, let's talk about the thing they were actually trying to build the whole time. The name has always amused me slightly. Tyrant. It's a bit on the nose, isn't it? There's no committee anywhere that approves a project name like that without at least one person raising an eyebrow. But it's stuck, and it's stuck hard enough that the entire virus is named after it. The T in T virus is tyrant. The zombies, the dogs, the lickers, all of it is named after a project most of them have nothing to do with, because that was the flagship and everything else was a byproduct. The goal was simple to state and enormously difficult to do. Take a human host with a rare genetic makeup compatible with the virus, apply it, and instead of a shambling corpse, you get something enormous, immensely strong, and crucially still capable of thought. Something you can give an order to and then leave alone. The first attempt is the T-1, the proto-tyrant, and it's a rough draft in every sense, big, powerful, and about as controllable as weather. It got out during the mess at the training facility and caused exactly the sort of problem you'd expect. The T-002 is the one that mattered. That's the one in the Arclay lab, and by all internal measures it was a success. Intelligence testing put it at close to the level of the human it had been before infection, which meant it could follow a broad range of instructions. Not attack that. Actual complexity. And then the files record its fatal flaw, and it's the sentence I keep going back to. Left alone for several months, it developed a sense of self. That's the failure state. Not aggression, not instability, not physical breakdown. It started being someone. Given enough time without direction, the thing worked out that it existed, and once it had worked that out, it stopped taking orders. Because why would it? I love that as a design problem because it's the problem nobody in that building was equipped to solve. They could handle a body rejecting a virus. They had no framework at all for a weapon developing an interior life. The fix, and this is very much a corporate fix rather than a scientific one, was to mass produce cloned tyrants. If the flaw is that a tyrant left alone becomes a person, then don't leave them alone, and don't make them unique. Make them a product line. That's the T103, modified clones of the T02, produced in quantity, and the number is its model designation. 103 marks it as the real thing, the mass production model, the thing the whole program was for. Manufacturing moved to a facility on Sheena Island from around August 1998, and the term used for it in the files is the tyrant plant, which I find wonderfully mundane. A plant. Like it's making washing machines. 6 of them were deployed into Raccoon City. One in particular, designated T-0, was sent in with 2 objectives: retrieve a virus sample and eliminate any surviving police or civilians who might talk about what happened there. That's the one in the coat, and the coat is my favourite piece of trivia in this entire section, because everyone assumes it's a costume choice. It isn't. It's a limiter. The garment restricts the tyrant's growth and keeps it in the stable, human-shaped configuration, because these things have a tendency to keep developing if you let them. And a tyrant that is fully expanded is faster and stronger and enormously harder to instruct. The coat keeps the product within spec, which means when one of them tears out of it mid-fight, that's not rage. That's the safety catch coming off. And it's coming off because the mission has gone badly enough that the limiter is now the bigger problem. The hat, admittedly, is just a hat. I've looked. There's no engineering justification for the hat, and I respect that enormously. The variants are where it gets strange, and I'll do these quickly because each of them could be its own knight. There's Ivan, built to look and behave human enough to move through normal society, used as a bodyguard by an umbrella colonel. At least two of them existed. The design brief there was essentially make it able to stand in a lift without anyone screaming, which is a very different problem from the usual one. There's Tyrant R, an experimental model fitted with a cybernetic control system, because someone decided the solution to obedience was hardware. It became self-aware anyway. Same floor, new packaging, and the first thing it did was kill the researcher who had been boasting about holding the detonator for the bomb implanted in its body. There's a lesson in there about not taunting the thing you've built, and nobody learned it. There's Thanatos, and there's TLOS, which is a tyrant with the facility's computer system driving it, and at that point you've stopped building a weapon and started building a very expensive argument about whether you're a serious research organisation. But the through line is always the same. Every single one of these projects fails in the same direction. They keep trying to build something intelligent enough to be useful, and then discovering that intelligent enough to be useful is also intelligent enough to have opinions. None of this was ever the point, though, not to the man at the top. The weapons were how he paid for the thing he actually wanted, and I think you have to know what that was before any of the rest of it makes sense. One more, and then I'll leave you alone. Spencer's actual plan was never bioweapons. That's worth saying plainly, because it's easy to come away from all this thinking the man was an arms dealer with a lab. He wasn't. The weapons were how he paid for the real thing. What he wanted was to be a god king. He'd read the same accounts everyone else had, the trial, the flower, the survivors who ruled for centuries. And where his colleagues saw a research opportunity, Spencer saw a job description. He wanted to industrialize the process the Underpire had run by ritual, produce a population of superior humans, and preside over them. That's the whole business plan. Everything else is revenue, which meant he needed people who could survive the process, and the odds of that in the general population are terrible. So he went looking for the raw material himself. There was a program. Children, gathered from various places, all of them selected for indicators that suggested unusual promise, and all of them given the Wesker name in the paperwork, and then placed in ordinary-looking circumstances, raised, educated, monitored, and at a certain point exposed. Almost all of them died. That's the number that sits with me. Not one or two. Practically the entire group, over years, in a program that was run patiently and quietly, and with excellent record-keeping, because the deaths were expected. They were the point. The whole thing was a screening exercise, dressed up as a boarding school. One of the survivors is the man we've already spent time on tonight, and I don't think you can understand him without this bit. He wasn't a scientist who went bad. He was a product, told from childhood that he was exceptional, who eventually found out that he was exceptional, because everyone he'd been raised alongside had been used up establishing it. His response to that was not to reject the ideology, it was to decide he should be running it, which is a very particular kind of damage, and I'd argue it's the most coherent character arc in the series. A man built by a filter, who spends his adult life designing a better filter. There was another survivor, incidentally, who went a different direction entirely and spent years trying to solve the problem of consciousness transfer rather than genetics, on the reasoning that a body is replaceable and a mind isn't. Same upbringing, same program, entirely different conclusion. I find that pairing interesting, and I don't think the games did as much with it as they could have. The administrative side of it is the part I keep turning over, though, because a program like that needs staff. It needs somebody choosing the children, somebody handling the paperwork that gives them a surname, somebody placing them with families, somebody visiting once a year to check how they're getting on at school. That's not a laboratory operation. That's a small department with a budget line and an annual review, doing what looks from the outside like child welfare. And every one of those people knew what the last step was. I think that's why the company works so well as a villain, actually. It isn't the monsters. Monsters are easy. It's the fact that everything terrible in this story required a functioning office behind it. Someone ordering the kerosene, someone dyeing the vials purple, someone writing up why homeless adults were the appropriate raw material. None of it happens without ordinary people doing ordinary jobs competently. And the thing that finishes Spencer off, in the end, isn't a monster or a task force. It's being told to his face that he was never special, that he'd found something ancient and powerful, and had spent 50 years failing to become anything more than the man who found it. He'd made kings out of other people's children, and hadn't managed it for himself. He dies in a chair, in a house on a cliff, having spent an enormous fortune and an enormous number of lives on a promotion he never got. Which is, when you line it up against the flower and the cave and the trial, more or less what the Underpire would have predicted. Most people who reach for it don't survive it. The system was always honest about that. Spencer just assumed the rules were for other people. Meanwhile, over in the European labs, a rather different group had been looking at the tyrant problem and had come to the conclusion that the fault was the brain and that the answer was to replace it. This one starts with a grudge, and I don't mean that figuratively. Umbrella's No. 6 laboratory in Europe had been running something called the Nemesis Project since the early to mid-80s. Different approach to the same problem. Rather than trying to engineer a host body that could think properly, they'd build a parasite that did the thinking for it. Implant that into whatever you've got, and the parasite handles the intelligence while the host handles the muscle. It's genuinely a clever idea, and it did not work for about 10 years. The parasite, designated N-alpha, was too aggressive. It went in, it took over, and the host died within about 5 minutes. Almost every N-alpha implantation attempt killed the host. They tested it on dogs. They tested it on hunters. Reptiles and amphibians turned out to have insufficient brain capacity for the parasite to do anything useful with, which only reinforced their view that humans were the ideal material, which is a conclusion they seemed happy to reach. The one exception we've already covered in 1988, and I won't go over it again. She survived it, nobody else did. So the project sat there, a decade of refinement with nothing to show for it, and then Arclay happened. The American branch's flagship tyrant, the one they'd been quietly resentful about for years, was destroyed by a police unit. Not a military strike, a few officers from a small mountain town. You can practically hear the mood in the European offices. They restart the Nemesis project immediately, and they requisition several of the new mass-production tyrant clones as hosts. Because that's the answer, isn't it? The parasite kills anything ordinary within minutes, but a tyrant isn't ordinary. A tyrant might survive it, and the name is the tell. Nemesis, the Greek goddess of retribution. They didn't name it after what it does, they named it after who it was for. This was built to hunt down the specific people who had embarrassed them. The implantation is not a gentle procedure. The parasite goes into the spine and works its way up to hijack the brain, sending tentacles out through the body as it goes. And on the way through, it tore the host open, the face, the right arm, the right side of the chest, the belly. Substantial structural damage from the inside done by the thing they were installing. So the development staff stapled it back together. That's it. That's the fix. They looked at the mess the procedure had made of a multi-million-dollar bioweapon, and they closed it with staples, which is why the finished creature looks the way it does. It lost its nose in the process, its lips, its right eye. All of that is not design. That's damage, held shut with metal, because the alternative was starting again, and nobody had the patience. I find that so much more unpleasant than if it had been designed to look horrific. It looks like that because somebody rushed. The parasite also keeps growing after implantation, uncontrollably, which is an ongoing structural problem rather than a solved one. And there's a compound in the cultivation process, VTJ98, thought to be a stabilizing agent, which suggests the whole thing needs chemical management just to stay in one piece. What they got in return was worth it from their point of view. The parasite runs its own brain alongside the host's, using both simultaneously, which pushes the intelligence well past anything the American branch had managed. It can make its own decisions in the field without direction. It can be trained on complex equipment. That's why it carries a rocket launcher. And that's rare. Few others in the Umbrella catalogue could operate a weapon. It also secretes something that boosts the host's regeneration considerably, so it heals faster than a tyrant should. And it was given one specific job: find the survivors of that police unit and kill them. The nickname in the files is the Pursuer, which is a much better name than Nemesis, and I'll die on that hill, which explains the thing everyone remembers. It says one word. It's not taunting anybody, and it's not a horror film flourish. That's the target designation. It's the entirety of what it was sent to do, said out loud, because the mission is the only thing in there. The program was shelved after Raccoon City, for obvious reasons. There was talk of commercializing it if they could ever get one to look vaguely human, which is a sentence I enjoy imagining in a sales meeting, but the company's collapse ended that. The parasite didn't end, though. There's an NE-beta developed later, which bonds to the base of a host's neck, and which seems to prefer infected hosts over living ones. And there's an NE-gamma, built by a criminal syndicate rather than Umbrella, designed for mass production and lower cost. The commercial version somebody eventually got round to making. That one leaves the host's mind intact mostly, and turns up rather recently in the hands of a former Umbrella researcher. But we'll come back to that at the end. For now, let's go back to the man who found the thing in Lisa's cells, because he did something with it that I still think is the strangest goal any character in this series has ever had. It's kept in purple liquid. That's a small thing, and I like it a lot. The samples are stored in a protein medium that's been dyed purple, and the reason is purely practical, so anyone reaching into a storage unit in a hurry can identify what they're holding without reading a label. Somebody thought about that. In a facility that couldn't be bothered to write down a procedure for burning bodies, somebody sat down and specified a color coding system for the vials. The official designation is the Golgotha virus. Everyone calls it G, and here's what makes it different from everything else we've talked about tonight. Umbrella financed it as a weapon, and Birkin never once thought of it that way. His goal was not a better zombie or a more controllable soldier. His goal was a new species. The distinction is this: the T virus causes mutation, but the mutations are random and uncoordinated. You get change without direction, which is why most of it produces failures. G causes mutation that goes somewhere. It evolves a host into something stable and coherent. And the crucial part, the part Birkin was actually chasing, is that the result can breed. The example in his own notes is dogs. Infect 2 dogs successfully, and you don't get 2 monsters, you get a mating pair, and their offspring are the same thing they are, a functioning population of something that did not previously exist. Scale that up, and you can see where he was going. He wanted G humans, not weapons, a successor species designed rather than evolved, and by extension, a world with him standing at the start of it. People in the labs called it the God virus, and I don't think that was entirely a joke, which is why he wouldn't hand it over. The whole disaster at Raccoon City happens because Birkin refused to give his employers a weapon they'd already paid for, because in his head it had stopped being a weapon years ago. Now, the mechanics, because they're unusual. G doesn't spread. That's the first thing people get wrong. It's not airborne, it's not in the water, you cannot catch it off someone in a corridor. Transmission requires injection or ingestion. It has to be put inside you deliberately. The second thing is compatibility, and it's strict. The host's genetic makeup has to be a close match, and in practice, that means blood relation. Anyone else is not a host. But, and this is the horrible bit, anyone else isn't immune either. What happens to an incompatible person is that the virus doesn't bond, it implants. A G embryo takes hold, gestates somewhere between 1 minute and 10, and then comes out through the chest. And it doesn't need a host after that. It grows into an adult on its own, and once it's an adult, it starts implanting embryos into other people, which produces more adults, which produce more. So the failure mode of this virus is a self-sustaining population of things that are not the virus and cannot spread the virus, but can absolutely fill a sewer system in about a week. The infection is a dead end and the byproduct is a colony. The trait that unsettles me most is in the research notes, and it applies to hosts and byproducts alike. Mutants produced by G spontaneously develop reproductive organs, and they're self-fertile. They don't need a partner. They don't need anything. The virus doesn't want a soldier. It wants descendants urgently, by whatever route is available. The files are quite frank that this made the whole thing unpredictable, and in Umbrella's assessment, not viable. Not because it was too weak, because it was liable to populate out of control, and nobody had worked out how to switch that off. Research was still incomplete when everything fell apart, which is why what happened to Birkin himself went the way it did. He was shot by his own company's retrieval team, and while dying he injected himself with an incomplete virus at a dose that was far too high. Compatible host, yes. Correct dose, no. So instead of the elegant thing he'd spent his career designing, he got the unrestrained version, and he became precisely the sort of unpredictable monster he'd written warnings about in his own reports. He also, as any adult would in a similar situation, kept mutating every time he was injured, because that's the other trait. Damage a G host and it responds by becoming something else. You cannot wear it down. Wearing it down is the input it wants. The daughter is the part that lands, though. He implanted an embryo in his own child, which is either the last act of a man who has stopped being a person, or the first act of one who genuinely believed he was giving her something. I've gone back and forth on that for years. She was treated with a retrovirus called Devil and survived, and she carries G antibodies afterward. Those antibodies matter enormously about 10 years later, in a way nobody involved could have predicted. We'll get to it. But now, let's leave Raccoon City entirely and go somewhere colder, because there's a family in this series who are doing all of this first and considerably more elegantly. The Ashfords are aristocracy in decline, and the whole storyline is basically what happens when a family with a very old name and a very fragile ego gets access to a laboratory. Edward Ashford was one of the 3 founders. He dies early in 1968, and everything after that is his descendants trying to get the name back to where they think it belongs, which is a very specific kind of madness, and it produces some of the strangest science in the series. Alexander Ashford is the one holding the family when it's already sliding. He's not a good scientist and he knows it, and his answer is to stop trying to compete and start trying to manufacture someone who can. So he takes the DNA of Veronica Ashford, the family matriarch from centuries back, and he produces 2 children with it, Alfred and Alexia, which is on its own worth pausing on. He didn't have children, he engineered ancestors, and it works in the sense that Alexia turns out to be a genuine prodigy. She's running her own research program as a child, actually running it, not being indulged. What she builds is Ta Veronica, and I've always had a soft spot for it. The problem she set out to solve is the one everybody had. Every virus in this family costs you your mind. That's the trade, power in exchange for the person. Alexia's target was a strain that left the host completely intact. Full cognition, full personality, plus everything the virus offers. Her solution is bizarre and it works. She takes the flower virus and she combines it with the genome of a queen ant that was carrying an ancient virus of its own, and she folds in plant genes on top of that. Ant, plant, and progenitor. The ant part isn't decoration either. It brings the hive with it, which is why the finished host can control insects. And it brings the queen's biology, which is why the mutations go the direction they go. But the virus has a condition attached, and the condition is the reason nobody else could have made this work. To keep your mind, the bonding process has to happen slowly. Very slowly. Rush it, and you get what everyone else gets, which is a monster with nobody home. The required period is 15 years. And she did it. She infected herself and put herself in cryogenic sleep for 15 years and let the virus bond at the pace it needed, which required her to be absolutely certain of a result she would not be conscious to observe. I think about that a lot. It's not bravery exactly. It's a level of confidence in your own working that I find slightly frightening. Her brother maintained the facility and the family and the fiction that she was elsewhere for the entire 15 years, almost alone, with a small, overworked staff. And he came apart doing it, in ways I won't detail here beyond saying that by the end, he wasn't entirely sure which of them he was. It's a strange bit of writing, and it holds up better than it has any right to. Now, the father, because this is where the family stops being merely eccentric. Alexander wanted the virus too, and the twins gave it to him. Not out of generosity. They used him as a test subject, which is a straightforward reversal of what he'd done to produce them. And there's a horrible symmetry to it that I don't think was accidental. He wasn't compatible. What he became is the thing that ends up in the Antarctic facility, and everyone calls it Nosferatu, a mutated body with its ribcage split open, kept alive in a cell by his own children for over a decade, entirely incapable of communicating what he was. A man who created two people to restore his family, dismantled by both of them, using the thing they made with his own ancestors. DNA. That's practically Greek. The other thing worth knowing about T. veronica hosts is that they burn. Mutants from this strain combust when killed, which is inherited from the insect side of the mix, and it means they leave nothing behind. Which was almost certainly deliberate on Alexia's part. She was not the sort of person who'd want samples of her work lying about. And that leads to the reason this section matters for later, because after all of that, after the 15 years and the ancestor DNA and the family collapsing in on itself, the thing T. veronica is best remembered for in the wider story is that somebody stole it and stripped out the clever part. A researcher called Carla Radames got hold of the data and reworked it into a variant called T02, and the entire purpose of that variant was to delete the incubation requirement. Alexia's one non-negotiable condition, the 15 years, the whole reason the virus preserved the mind, gone, engineered out for convenience, which is the most Resident Evil thing that could possibly have happened to it. The one piece of genuinely careful science in the entire franchise, and its legacy is somebody speeding it up so it could be produced at scale. We'll come back to what she did with it. But first, let's go to Spain, because there's something under a castle there that's considerably older than any of this. Amber is fossilized tree resin. It's the stuff you see in museums with an insect trapped inside it, perfectly preserved, 40 million years old, and looking like it landed yesterday. That's where these things were. Las Plagas are parasitic arthropods, and they're ancient. Not decades old, not centuries, genuinely old as a species. And at some point in their history, they were sealed underground in a region of Spain, in deposits that included substantial amounts of amber, and the amber did what amber does. The sealing was deliberate, and this is the part of the story I find properly good. A cult called Los Iluminados had been using these parasites for a very long time, and in 1741 they were defeated by the local nobility, a Salazar, the first count of the region. And having beaten them, the Salazar family didn't destroy the parasites. They couldn't, so they sealed them under the castle instead, and then committed themselves to keeping them sealed. For centuries, generation after generation of one family, whose entire inherited purpose was to be the lock on a door. That's a genuinely tragic setup, because you already know how it ends. All it takes is one descendant who doesn't take it seriously. That descendant is Ramon Salazar, 8th of the line, and he was young, and he was manipulated by a man called Osman Sadler, and between them they opened it. They hired local villagers to do the excavating, because of course they did, and they dug down into the deposits. This is the bit that makes the whole thing work, and in my opinion, it's the best single piece of lore in that game. The dig was a success. They got down there and found the parasites, and the parasites seemed dead, extinct, fossilized remains, and nothing else. Centuries of family obligation, an enormous excavation, and the prize was a fossil. Sadler's grand project ended before it started, and the files described them as disheartened by it. Except the spores in the fossilized amber were still viable, and the miners breathed them in. So the species resurrected itself, not through anyone's research, not through anyone's plan, but through the lungs of the labourers hired to confirm it was dead. The parasites came back inside the people who dug them up. Nobody did that. It just happened, because amber is very good at its job. Once Sadler had living specimens, the rest was straightforward. They worked out reproduction, they started producing eggs in bulk, and the eggs went into people. The tiers are worth going through, because there's a proper hierarchy here, and it amounts to the entire political structure of that region. At the bottom is the subordinate species, and that's the vast majority of what you'd encounter. The parasite takes the host's free will entirely. The body keeps working, the memories mostly stay, motor skills stay, and there are stretches where an infected villager will go through the motions of their old life. But the will is gone. They're networked into something else, and they receive orders. The delivery mechanism is ultrasound. High-frequency signals the host body responds to whether the person wants it to or not, which is why Sadler carries that staff about. It's not ceremonial, it's a transmitter. I've always thought that's the detail that makes these lot worse than zombies. A zombie is a person who's gone. A ganado is a person who is still in there somewhere, doing the shopping and mending the fence, receiving instructions on a frequency they can't hear and have no way to refuse. Above that sits the dominant species, and the difference is total. A dominant host keeps their mind. They keep their personality, their reasoning, their speech, and critically, they aren't susceptible to the ultrasound orders that the subordinate hosts follow, which is exactly why they're called dominant. They give the orders instead. Anyone carrying one can command the rank and file directly. They can also trigger their own mutation, more or less at will, and no two of them do it the same way. The transformation appears to be shaped by the host, their circumstances, their state of mind at the moment they trigger it, which means every dominant host in the story becomes a completely different sort of monster. Sadler had one, Salazar had one, the village chief had one, which is how the village got recruited in the first place. There's a cost though, and the files are clear about it. Dominant hosts suffer physical deformity, and worse, personality corruption. They become so fixated on their goals that they lose any capacity for reasoning around them. Sadler genuinely believed he was building a world without suffering, and he had a parasite in him that made it impossible for him to ever examine that belief, which strikes me as a properly nasty piece of design, whether anyone intended it or not. The thing that gives you the power to lead also removes your ability to wonder whether you should. And in the remake's version of events, there's a third category, the superior species, which is engineered rather than natural. It's built to keep the host's cognition intact and ensure they still answer to a dominant, without granting the monstrous forms. Corruption of the mind, yes. Transformation, no. Which is a genuinely nasty middle option. You stay yourself mostly, and you obey anyway. The village end of it is dressed up as faith naturally. They call it a blood purification ritual. You come forward, you're injected, you're purified. Whole community, one at a time, queuing up for it. And the reason nobody in the village ran is that the chief went first and told them it was the way. The scope is the thing. There's a moment in that game where you're given a thermal imaging scope, and until you have it, you're in genuine trouble, because you've spent the last 20 minutes emptying every gun you own into something that will not stop, and you've started to wonder whether the game is broken. That's the Regenerador, and the reason it doesn't die is a design decision. A standard host carries one parasite. A Regenerador carries several, all at once, in a single body. And each of them is independently rebuilding tissue at speed, so damage anywhere gets undone by whichever one is nearest. You can blow a hole through the torso and watch it close. You can take off a leg and it regrows. There is no amount of ammunition that solves this, because you're competing against several separate repair systems that don't get tired. Kill the parasites, and the entire body collapses at once, not slumps, collapses immediately, because the thing holding it together has stopped. Hence the scope. You look through it and you can see them, glowing, distributed through the body in slightly different arrangements from one creature to the next. And then it becomes an entirely different sort of encounter, a targeting problem instead of a shooting problem, with something walking toward you the whole time. I think it's the best enemy design in the series, and I'd argue it works because the solution is knowledge rather than firepower. You don't beat it with a bigger gun. You beat it by finally understanding what you're looking at. The Iron Maiden is the follow-up, and the files are explicit that it's an iteration rather than an accident. Somebody looked at the Regenerador, decided it was viable as a weapons platform, and asked what else it could do. The answer was spines, needles grown out through the skin that extend several feet on command, same regeneration underneath, same solution required, a lot less room for error. They were produced on an island facility, and the research that made both of them possible was substantially the work of one man, Luis Serra, which is worth remembering when you meet him. El Gigante goes the other direction entirely. That's a Plaga variant engineered specifically to drive muscle growth without limit, and it does exactly that. You end up with something enormous. The trade is that this particular variant absolutely wrecks cognitive function. There's essentially nothing in there. So you've got extraordinary strength attached to no judgment whatsoever, which is useful if you want a thing that knocks a wall down, and useless for anything requiring a second thought. The parasite eventually breaks out of the back if the host takes enough damage, and that's the only place it can be hurt properly, which is a pattern you'll notice repeating. Then there's the Verdugo, and those are the ones that unsettle me. Salazar's personal bodyguards, 2 of them, and they don't look remotely human anymore. Long, insectile, with a tail, moving in a way nothing that size should move. They're quiet, which is the worst part. Everything else in that region shouts. Salazar had them because he'd been assigned something to protect, and this is a detail I didn't know for years. There's a queen plaga under that castle, a large specimen that reproduces asexually, continuously, generating new parasites around the clock. That's the supply. Salazar's actual job in the organization wasn't governance or command. It was custodian of the breeding stock, which is a considerable demotion from what he thought he was getting. And then a handful worth a line each because they show how broadly this stuff was applied. Del Lago, the thing in the water, which is a lake creature that got dosed and became enormous. Colmillos, which are dogs, with the parasite erupting out of the back in 2 whipping tendrils. No vistadors, which are the insect ones, with active camouflage, and which are apparently the result of the parasite being applied to people who were experimented on, if the more disturbing readings of that file are right. And U3, which is a purpose-built weapon that doesn't resemble anything, and which Sadler seems genuinely proud of. The pattern across all of it is the same. One parasite applied to different hosts under different conditions produces wildly different results, and the organisation just kept trying combinations to see what came out. Now the fun detail, and it's a sad one, Luis Sierra worked on this, not peripherally. He was a major contributor to the Plaga bioweapons research, and the Regeneradors and the Iron Maidens exist in part because he was good at his job, and he spent the back half of his life trying to undo it, building the suppression drug, working out how to remove a parasite from a host without killing them, which nobody else had any interest in solving because there was no money in it. He kept research equipment running in a village where being caught with it would have finished him. He's one of the very few people in this entire series who looked at what he'd built and did something about it, and the thanks he gets for that is not much at all. A sample of this left Spain not long after Sadler's operation came apart, and it ended up somewhere a great deal larger. The mouth is the difference. In Spain, the parasites went in as eggs, injected, and then took time to develop inside the host. That's a slow process with a lot of failure in it, and if you're trying to convert a population quickly, it's a bottleneck. The version that shows up in Kijuju, developed by a pharmaceutical company called Tricell, working from smuggled samples, removes the weight. These parasites are inserted as mature organisms. Adult arthropods forced into a host's mouth, no egg stage, no incubation, straight in and working. It's a grotesque bit of process improvement, and it explains why the infected there behave differently from the ones in Spain. Faster conversion, more consistent results, and hosts that hold together better under damage. They're called margini locally, and there are broadly 2 types in circulation, depending on which region you're in, which is essentially a product line with regional variants. Someone was iterating. The animals got the same treatment. Adulae are the dogs, local, domestic, and wild animals given the type 2 parasite, and they behave much like their Spanish equivalents. Popocarimu is a bat, scaled up a great deal, and the name apparently comes from Swahili. And Desu is the big one, the local equivalent of the giant, named after a man-eating monster from Central African folklore, which I appreciate as a bit of naming discipline. Someone in the naming department was at least paying attention to where they were. Now, the reason any of this was happening in that particular part of the world, it's the same region we started in. That's not a coincidence in the writing, and it's not a coincidence in universe either. The whole operation was set up close to the origin of everything, because the man running it had gone back to the source. That's Albert Wesker, and Ouroboros is his answer to the entire franchise. The idea is this. Over the course of about a decade, he'd accumulated samples of essentially everything, the original strain, G. T. veronica, the dominant parasites, out of Spain, and rather than trying to build a better weapon out of them, he went back to the flower and tried to make the original virus usable. Pure Progenitor kills nearly everyone. We covered why. Wesker's position was that this wasn't a flaw, it was a feature that hadn't been applied properly. Ouroboros is the result, and the plan attached to it isn't conquest, it's a filter. Release it globally. Everyone whose genetics can't take it dies, which is the overwhelming majority of the human race. Everyone who can take it becomes something else, and Wesker considered the result an improvement worth the cost. Not a war, a screening process applied to approximately 6 billion people with no appeal. I find that genuinely more chilling than the standard world domination line, because he's not asking for control of anything. He doesn't want to rule the survivors. He just wants the survivors to be the sort of people he approves of, and he considers the deaths a rounding error on the way there. But the virus wouldn't stabilize. Too lethal even for his purposes, killing hosts he had reason to believe should have been compatible. And this is where the thread comes back round, and it's the piece of writing in that game I'd hold up as genuinely well constructed. He stabilized it using antibodies taken from Jill Valentine. She had them because she had been infected in Raccoon City by the thing the European branch built to hunt her. She survived that, developed antibodies, and 11 years later, her blood is the missing component in a virus designed to end the species. Which means the entire Ouroboros project runs on the biology of a woman who survived an assassination attempt. She's kept alive in a facility for years, being drained, because her immune system solved a problem that a decade of research couldn't. There's a real cruelty in that. The reward for surviving is being turned into a component. And the last thing about Ouroboros, which I think doesn't get said enough, it didn't work. No human being is known to have successfully mutated from it. Not one. The 3 people who weren't destroyed by it were all already mutants before exposure, which means they don't count as a result. Everything else that comes into contact with it produces the black, writhing mass, which is not an evolved being, it's a failure, a body that couldn't process the virus being consumed by it. So Wesker's grand successor species, the culmination of everything, the thing worth killing the world for, has a success rate of 0. Every single one of the creatures you encounter is a demonstration that his theory was wrong, and he was standing there in the middle of them insisting it was working, which honestly is the most human thing about him. Somebody else was working from that same shelf of samples around the same time, and they went about it very differently. The word means devil. It's Serbo-Croatian, and given where the outbreak starts, that's a fairly direct piece of naming. The people encountering these things weren't in a briefing room with a designation on a slide. They were in a war zone in Eastern Europe, watching soldiers get up after being shot. And they called them what they called them, and it stuck. The virus is C for chrysalid, and it's an assembly job. Carla Radamis took the reworked T. veronica variant we mentioned earlier, the one with the 15-year requirement engineered out, and spliced it with the G variant found in Sherry Birkin's blood. Which is why those antibodies from all those years ago end up mattering. A girl who survived her father's virus becomes, without her knowledge or consent, half the recipe for the next one. What C does is combine the best properties of both. From T. veronica, it takes the preservation of intelligence. From G, it takes regeneration, and the capacity to keep evolving after the first transformation. So a Javo is not a zombie in any meaningful sense. They think. They follow orders received before and after infection. They retain everything they knew how to do, which in this case meant a rebel militia carried on being a rebel militia, using firearms, driving tanks, flying aircraft, coordinating tactically, holding positions. The only difference is that they'd become extremely difficult to kill and had lost most of their impulse control. That's a much worse problem than a horde. A horde has no plan. Now the regeneration, which is where it gets strange. Damage a Javo's arm, and it doesn't heal back into an arm. It regrows as something else. The mutations are called Ruka Fatanje, and what comes back has the characteristics of a different animal entirely. A pincer, a blade, something with too many joints. Injure a different part of the body, and you get a different result again, and the result varies between individuals. So the act of shooting one is also the act of upgrading it, which is a wonderfully unfair mechanic, and I remember finding it quite stressful the first time. But there's a ceiling. Push the regeneration too far, and the process generates so much heat that the host burns alive from the inside. Which means a Javo taking sustained damage will eventually self-immolate, not as a defense, but because the thing keeping it alive has overloaded. Its own healing cooks it. And then the chrysalis, which is where the virus gets its name. If a Javo takes enough damage, or in some cases just because conditions are right, the outer body hardens into a shell, That's the insect side of the mix showing through, inherited from the ant genome that Alexia put in there decades earlier. And inside that shell, the body liquefies. Everything that was a person dissolves and then resolidifies into something with an entirely different architecture. What comes out has almost no human features left, and it can happen in seconds, not a slow cocoon. You shoot a soldier, the soldier hardens, and before you've reloaded, something else has torn its way out of the shell. The shell itself is extraordinarily tough. There's a weakness to high current electricity, which somebody presumably discovered by accident, and it's not much use in most situations. They burn on death, same as the T. veronica mutants, which is inherited. And their vision is unusually sensitive, because they've only just been assembled and everything is new, which makes flash grenades far more effective than they have any right to be. Now the other version, which I think trips people up, the zombies in that game and the Java in that game are the same virus behaving differently, and the difference is delivery. Inject C directly and you get a Javo. Intelligence intact, mutation available, regeneration running. Release it as a gas and you get zombies, because the gas either kills the host first or damages them badly enough that there's nothing left to preserve, and all the virus can do at that point is reanimate the corpse. The regeneration inherited from G is good enough to restore function to something that's already dead, which is how you get whole crowds coming up at once. Same substance, entirely different outcome, decided by how it arrived. And the delivery mechanism for the gas is itself a creature, Lepetitsa, which produces the cloud from its own body and walks through a population, converting everyone in the vicinity. Not a weapon someone deploys. A weapon that walks itself into position and then exhales. The name means beauty, incidentally. Someone had a sense of humour about it, and I'm not sure I approve. That's the last of the viruses, more or less, which leaves the one thing in this series that isn't a virus at all and predates every single person we've talked about tonight. In 1919, a woman walked into a cave to die. Her name was Miranda. She lived in a mountain village in Eastern Europe, and the Spanish flu had just been through. It took a lot of people in that village, and one of them was her daughter, Eva, who was 10. And Miranda, having buried her, went into the caves under the village to end it. She didn't. She touched something instead. Underneath that village, there's a fungal organism the size of a small town. The locals had a name for it that translates roughly as the Black God. The scientific designation eventually settled on megamycete, and it had been down there for a very long time, long enough that there's a cave-dwelling society associated with it that simply isn't there anymore, and long enough that there was a documented flare-up of activity in the 15th century where infected people were assumed to be monsters, which is probably where a fair chunk of the region's folklore comes from. Miranda made contact with it, and it infected her, and she got memories, not visions, memories, everything the organism had ever absorbed, and it had been absorbing the dead of that region for centuries. Thousands of lives, all of it arriving at once, in a woman who had gone down there specifically because she couldn't carry the one she had. And Ava was in there. That's the whole story, really. Everything after it is 100 years of a grieving woman with unlimited time trying to get her daughter out of a fungus. Now the mechanics, which are more grounded than you'd expect. Real fungal colonies do two things that matter here. Quorum sensing, which is how a colony detects how many of itself are present and coordinates behaviour accordingly. And horizontal gene transfer, which is the passing of genetic material sideways between organisms rather than down through reproduction. Both of these are actually how fungi work. This one does both at a scale that stops being biology and starts being something else. Thoughts and memories move between clusters the way information moves through a network. Genetic characteristics get stored, catalogued, and handed out. It's less an organism than a library that eats. Miranda bonded with it on a cellular level, which as far as anyone can tell, has never happened to anybody else. She stopped aging. She could alter her own cells, take other shapes, and she kept doing all of it for over a century while looking about 30. The problem was that direct exposure to the mold kills nearly everyone, so she couldn't simply repeat what happened to her. She needed a delivery system. She found one by accident, and it's my favourite detail here. There were parasitic nematodes in the cave system that had been infected by the mold, and rather than dying, they'd adapted to it and kept all their parasitic behaviour intact, which meant here was an organism that would happily enter a human body, settle in, and distribute the mold throughout it at a controlled rate. She named them kadu. The word means gift. That's what the villagers were told they were receiving. And in a village where she had, decades earlier, presented herself as the doctor who cured the flu, they believed her. What happens next depends entirely on compatibility, and the odds are bad. Most recipients die. Below that, poor compatibility produces the lichens, feral, wolf-shaped, no self left, which is where the local werewolf stories come from. Women who receive it tend to produce a different form again, which is where a different set of stories come from. And a very small number of people are exceptionally compatible, and they get something else entirely. Their minds stay, their personalities stay, more or less, and they develop abilities that are specific to them and nobody else, which is how you end up with 4 people running that region as effective nobility. A woman who can alter her own body and produce insect swarms, a woman who can distribute her consciousness across dolls, a man who can restructure himself into something aquatic, and a man who can manipulate metal. None of them were chosen for their qualities. They were the ones who survived a compatibility test, which is a system we've seen before at the other end of the world involving a flower. I do think that's deliberate. The whole series ends up back at the same idea. Everything that matters is decided by whether your genome happened to match, and everything on top of that, the cults, the kingdoms, the corporations, is scaffolding built around a coin flip. None of them were what Miranda wanted either. All 4 are failures by her standard, because she was only ever testing vessels. Which brings in the last piece. In 2000, a criminal syndicate called the Connections approached her, and she gave them a sample of the mold and her daughter's DNA. What they produced was designated E01, and they called her Eveline, a name that's obviously an echo of Eva, and I don't think anyone involved was being subtle. She was engineered out of the mold itself, given the emotional development of a small child and an absolute compulsion toward having a family, which is a horrifying thing to build into a weapon on purpose. And she could infect people directly, control them, and produce the black shapes that come out of the walls in that house. Bodies of mold that were previously people, or in some cases just mold in the shape of a person. And the way it reached Louisiana is almost mundane. A contaminated tanker washed inland by a hurricane in October 2014, and over 3 years the colony spread out from where it grounded, through swamp, into houses, and eventually as far as a salt mine. No plan, no deployment, weather. The thing I keep coming back to about the megamycete is that it never wanted anything. It has no goals. It isn't a villain, and it wasn't built. It's a very old organism that stores what it absorbs, sitting under a village, doing nothing at all, until a grieving woman touched it and recognized her daughter's voice in the noise. We should go back and talk about James Marcus properly, because he's the one who started all of it, and he's also the one who got the worst deal out of it, and the thing he became is one of the stranger creatures in the series. Marcus was the scientist of the 3 founders. Spencer had the ambition and the money and the ability to talk people into things. Edward Ashford had the name. Marcus had the actual skill, and he was the one who worked out what to do with the flower. And he was the one who built the virus everyone else spent the next 30 years using. He also had a particular fondness for leeches, which started as a research interest and became something closer to a hobby, and then rather further than that. The training facility he ran was an umbrella-operated corporate installation. He was head of it, he taught there, and he kept his real work in the basement, which is where the leech colonies were. He'd been infecting them, breeding them, and watching them behave in ways leeches shouldn't. And in 1988, Spencer had him killed. That's the bit that always gets me about the founders. There's no falling out over ethics. There's no grand betrayal scene. Spencer simply worked out that Marcus's research was more valuable than Marcus and had 2 men shoot him in his own laboratory and then took the work. Marcus fell into the water where the leeches were kept. What happens next only works because of a property we've already established, which is that the virus can bring back cells that have stopped. The colony consumed him. And the colony had been so thoroughly saturated with his own virus for so long that it didn't just eat him, it absorbed him. His genetic material went into it. And then, over the following decade, the colony began to organise around what it had taken in. 10 years later, there's something in that facility that thinks it's James Marcus. It looks like him. It can hold his shape, wear his coat, speak with his voice, and it remembers being murdered, which is the part that drives everything it does. But it isn't him. It's a colony of leeches holding a memory of a man in the same way a crowd might hold a rumour. And when it stops holding the shape comes apart into what it actually is, which is thousands of individual organisms that have been pretending, collectively, to be a person. I find that a much more disturbing idea than most of the deliberate monsters in this series. Everything else we've talked about tonight was made. This one assembled itself out of grief and biology, in the dark, with no one supervising, over 10 years. The intermediate stages are worth a mention. There are leech humans in that facility, hosts overwhelmed by the colony to the point where the body is only a container, standing upright and moving because the leeches inside it have collectively decided it should. They come apart the same way when you damage them enough. There's no person in there to kill. And the final form, which everyone calls the Queen Leech, is the colony giving up on the human shape entirely and becoming something enormous and segmented. It's still Marcus, in the sense that it's still running on the memory and the grudge. It's just stopped bothering with the disguise. The other thing about Marcus's leeches that I think is underrated is what they can do to a virus. Because he wasn't only breeding them, he was using them as living laboratories, and there's a strain of the virus that came out of that process which behaves differently to anything the American labs were making. When the colony is involved, the infection spreads more aggressively and behaves more like a coordinated thing than a disease, which raises a question I've never seen answered properly. The leech DNA is not in the original virus. It's the stabilizing component, the thing that made a usable weapon out of something too lethal to work with. Every T-virus zombie in the games has a bit of leech in it somewhere. So when a colony absorbs a person and starts behaving like that person, is that a freak occurrence? Or is that a property that was in the virus the entire time and simply never had the right conditions to show itself anywhere else? The files don't say. I suspect the answer is that nobody wanted to find out, because the implication is that everything the company made was quietly capable of holding on to some fragment of who it used to be, and that's a considerably worse thought than a corridor full of monsters. Spencer, for what it's worth, never learned what happened. He took the research, he built the company on it, and he spent the rest of his life believing he'd solved the Marcus problem in an afternoon in 1988. He hadn't. It just took 10 years and a basement full of leeches to get an answer back. He didn't have all that long left himself, mind you, and neither did the company. Which brings me neatly to the part of this story that doesn't get covered much, because it's less dramatic than a mansion or a cult, and I think it's the thing that actually defines the setting. Umbrella collapsed, court cases, an enormous scandal, the trials, the business suspension order, the lot. From a narrative standpoint, that should be the end. Company dies, monsters stop. Monsters got more common. Because a research corporation that size doesn't have one secret. It has thousands of them, stored in dozens of facilities across multiple continents. And when the parent company stops existing, those facilities don't vanish. They get abandoned or sold or quietly emptied by people who worked there and knew what was in the freezers. So the samples went out into the world. All of them. And the buyers were not other pharmaceutical companies. The pattern that shows up again and again afterwards is that the people using this material are smaller, stranger, and much harder to police. Cults, arms dealers, private militaries, individual scientists with a grievance and a garage. The scale of what any one of them can do is smaller than what the corporation could do, but there are far more of them and nobody's keeping a list. The prices tell the story too. There's a mention in the files about a South American buyer who stopped purchasing bioweapons from Umbrella because the trials had driven the prices up and simply switched supplier. That's it. That's the entire consequence of one of the largest scandals in that world, a change of vendor, and the demand shaped what got made. We touched on this earlier with a particular blind, wall-climbing product line that stayed in production purely because buyers kept asking for it. The market didn't want elegance. It wanted things that were tough, that were intimidating, and that could be shown to a client. I find that a genuinely bleak commentary, and I don't think it's accidental. The horror in the early games is institutional, a company, a facility, a chain of command. The horror later on is that the institution was never the problem. It was a supplier. Remove it, and the demand is still there, and the demand finds someone else. The other thing the aftermarket does is scramble the science, and this is why the law gets so tangled after a certain point. When everything was in one company's hands, the lineages were clean. This strain came off that one. This project reported to that department. Once it's all loose, people start combining things that were never meant to meet, and they're doing it without the original notes. Which is how you get a virus assembled out of a woman's 15-year masterpiece and a dead man's evolutionary project, mixed by someone who had access to neither of their reasoning. And it's how you get parasites from Spain crossed with corporate research from West Africa, in a facility built by a company that had nothing to do with either. Every generation of this stuff is further from anybody who understood the last one. It's a game of telephone, played with biology. You can see it in the paperwork too, or rather, in the absence of it. The early material has files attached to everything: progress reports, development logs, internal memos with dates on them, the occasional bit of office politics showing through. Somebody was keeping records because somebody upstairs was going to ask. The later stuff mostly does have that. There's no development log for what a militia leader in Eastern Europe was injecting people with. Nobody wrote a progress report on the thing in the water. The documentation thins out at exactly the point the material spreads out, which is the opposite of what you'd want. And that's the shape of it, really. One company with terrible ethics and excellent record keeping, replaced by several hundred operations with the same ethics, and no records at all. Whether that's better or worse depends entirely on what you think the records were ever for. Anyway, there's one strain out of all that catalogue I want to finish on, partly because it's the strangest one, and partly because almost nobody talks about it. Here's a thread most people miss entirely, because it's tucked away in a game that came out on a handheld and never quite got the attention it deserved. There's a virus called T-Abyss, and it's the only one in the series built for water. The base is a strain that came out of Umbrella Europe, and the thing that makes it distinct is what got added: genetic material from deep-sea organisms. Abyssal fish, the ones that live under pressures that would fold a submarine, in permanent darkness, with biology that's frankly strange even before anyone starts interfering with it. What that produces is an infection that works in water, which sounds like a small distinction, and absolutely isn't, because every other virus we've discussed tonight is limited by the fact that its hosts have to breathe air and stand on something. The delivery mechanism is the horrifying part. T-Webis can be released into water and it stays viable. Contaminate a reservoir, a harbour, a stretch of coast, and you've infected everything living in it and everyone who drinks from it. There's no need for a bite or an injection or a cult handing out gifts. You pour it in, and the creatures it makes are built accordingly. There's a class of them that can effectively liquefy, bodies that lose structural cohesion and move like something poured out of a jug, reassembling on the other side of a gap you thought was too small, which is a nightmare in a ship's corridors, because there's no such thing as a sealed room anymore. There's always a drain. The setting for all this is a cruise liner, and I've always thought that's an inspired choice. A ship is the perfect container for a story like this. It's finite, it's full of corridors, and crucially, you cannot leave. Every other outbreak in this series happens in a place people are theoretically able to run from. On a ship in open water, the geography itself is doing the work. The politics behind it are worth knowing too, because they're a bit different from the usual corporate greed. By this point, Umbrella is gone. The organisation dealing with bioterrorism is an international body, and the man near the top of it decided the best way to guarantee his agency's continued authority was to make sure bioterrorism kept happening. So he arranged an incident from the inside and set it up so that a rival organisation would take the blame. That's a different flavour of villain to the ones we've been talking about. Nobody's building a successor species. Nobody's trying to resurrect a daughter. It's a man protecting a budget, and he's willing to sink a city to do it. Honestly, that might be the most realistic motivation in the entire franchise, which is a depressing thing to say out loud. There's a creature in that story I want to mention specifically because it stayed with me longer than most. The Skag Dead, a host where the infection hasn't fully taken the mind. The body has been rebuilt into something enormous and misshapen, with the original head still present and still partially aware. And it talks, not orders, not a target designation. It rambles, it argues with itself, because there are effectively two things sharing one skull, and neither of them is winning, which is more or less the failure state everybody in this series has been trying to engineer around since the beginning. They wanted the power without losing the person. What they kept getting instead was a person left in there just enough to notice what had happened. The other creatures on that ship are worth a mention too, and they're a strange assortment. There are things that were fish first and have been enlarged into something with far too many teeth. There are hosts that have gone in the aquatic direction so completely that the human outline has stopped being readable. And there are the ooze forms, which are the ones I described earlier, moving through the plumbing. What I find odd about the whole set is how quiet they are. Most of the creatures we've talked about tonight announce themselves. They shout, they growl, they say the one word they've been given. The ones on that ship mostly don't. They come up out of standing water without much noise at all, which in a vessel where every deck has bilge and every corridor has a low point is a genuinely poor arrangement for anyone living there. And the ship itself is the last thing I'll say about it. It's a cruise liner. It was built for people to have a nice time on, with a ballroom and a dining hall and a promenade deck, and all of that is still there underneath everything, gilded and slightly damp. There's something about the specific combination of chandeliers and standing water that I've never quite shaken. It was found drifting eventually, empty, more or less, still afloat, still lit in places with the lifts working, which is about as fitting an image as this series has ever produced for the whole business. Something enormous and expensive and beautifully appointed, going nowhere in particular, with whatever's left aboard still moving about in the dark. And that's most of it. 50-odd years of research, 4 continents, several corporate collapses, and all of it running back to a plant nobody could grow. The list isn't finished, mind you. Requiem came out in February and put a few more things on it. The blister heads, which are what happens when you don't finish the job, on a body, and it comes back with its head turned into something you'd rather not describe, and a version of that old European parasite that a former Umbrella researcher got hold of and used on himself, which suggests the file on all this is still open and somebody will keep adding to it. I've left a fair bit out, obviously. Umbrella's internal politics could be its own night. The branch rivalries, the boardroom manoeuvring, the fact that a company that size collapsed less from being caught out and more from the sheer weight of its own departments competing. And the Ashfords deserve a proper sit-down on their own rather than the 20 minutes they got here, because there's considerably more to that family than I managed to fit in. Maybe I'll do those. We'll see how the mood takes me. Thanks for staying up with me. Sleep well.